I never planned to reveal my true identity at my parents' company retirement dinner. Honestly, I almost didn't go. But when your mother calls you 3 times in one afternoon, sobbing about how this might be Dad's last chance to feel proud at Meridian Industries, you cave. You show up, even when every instinct tells you to stay home. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. So there I was, standing outside the Grandview Conference Center in Millbrook Heights, wearing a simple black dress I'd bought at Target 2 years ago, and carrying a purse that had seen better days. The parking lot was filled with BMWs and Mercedes, gleaming under the amber streetlights like trophies of corporate success. I felt like an imposter before I even walked through the glass doors. My parents, Thomas and Patricia Wilde, had worked at Meridian Industries for 37 years combined. Dad started in the mailroom when he was 22, worked his way up to senior facilities manager. Mom joined the accounting department 5 years later, eventually becoming a mid-level bookkeeper. They were good employees. Reliable, punctual, the kind of people who never missed a day and always stayed late when needed. They were also the kind of people who believed in staying in your lane, knowing your place, and never reaching beyond what was realistic. Which is exactly why they'd given up on me years ago. I pushed through the revolving door into the lobby, where the sound of clinking glasses and polite laughter echoed off marble walls. The Meridian Industries logo, a sleek silver mountain peak, dominated the space behind the registration table. Employees in expensive suits clustered around cocktail tables, talking about quarterly reports and promotion tracks. This was their world, their kingdom of stability and predictable success. And I was the family disappointment who'd walked away from all of it. Cassandra! My mother's voice cut through the ambient chatter like a knife through silk. She appeared at my elbow, resplendent in a navy dress suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her smile was bright but strained, the kind she wore when she was trying to make the best of a bad situation. "You made it! I was worried you might. Well, you know how you are about these things." "Here I am," I said simply, accepting the awkward half-hug she offered. She stepped back and examined me with the critical eye of someone who'd spent decades trying to fix what she saw as broken. "You look nice. Different, but nice. I brought that blazer I mentioned, the one from my closet, just in case you wanted to look a little more." She gestured vaguely at the crowd around us. "Professional." The blazer in question was draped over her arm like a peace offering, or maybe a flag of surrender. It was beige, conservative, and everything I'd spent the last 8 years trying not to be. "Thanks, Mom, but I'm fine as I am." Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she nodded. "Of course, sweetheart, you know best." The words came out like she was reciting lines from a play she'd been forced to memorize. "Your father's already inside, mingling with his colleagues. He's so excited you're here, even if you can only stay for a little while." The assumptions stung, even though it shouldn't have. They'd been making assumptions about my life, my choices, and my limitations for so long that I'd almost started believing them myself. Almost. We walked into the main ballroom together, Mom's heels clicking authoritatively against the polished floor while my flats whispered quietly beside her. The room was decorated in Meridian's corporate colors, silver and deep blue, with round tables draped in pristine white linens. A banner stretched across the far wall, celebrating 40 years of excellence. Meridian Industries. Dad spotted us immediately. Thomas Wilde had the kind of face that looked perpetually worried, as if he was always waiting for the other shoe to drop. Tonight, though, his expression was almost hopeful. He weaved through the crowd toward us, his tie slightly crooked and his smile just a little too wide. "There's my girl." He pulled me into a bear hug that smelled of aftershave and nervous energy. "I can't believe you actually came. When your mother said she'd invited you, I thought—" He trailed off, probably remembering that finishing that sentence wouldn't help anyone. I wouldn't miss it, Dad. The lie came easily. I'd been practicing diplomatic responses for years. He held me at arm's length, studying my face like he was looking for signs of the daughter he'd once known. You look good, Cass. Healthy. Are you eating enough? That apartment of yours in Riverside, is it safe? The neighborhood looked a little rough when we drove by last month. You drove by my apartment? Mom jumped in quickly. We were just in the area, running errands. We didn't stop or anything. We know how you value your privacy. Her voice carried the subtle reproach of a parent who felt shut out of their child's life, even though they'd been the ones to build the walls. The truth was, I'd moved to Riverside specifically because it was across town from their comfortable suburban bubble in Oakwood Estates. I needed space to become who I really was, not who they thought I should be. But explaining that would require conversations we'd been avoiding for years. The apartment's fine, I said, and I'm eating plenty. Dad nodded enthusiastically as if my basic survival was a remarkable achievement. That's good. And work? How's that? He fumbled for words, his face scrunching slightly. The freelance thing. Consulting, I corrected gently. It's going well. Right. Consulting. He said the word like he was trying to taste something unfamiliar. I still don't quite understand what that means, but as long as you're paying your bills, he shrugged with the helpless expression of someone trying to be supportive, while fundamentally not understanding the thing they're supporting. Mom looped her arm through mine with practiced cheerfulness. Come on, let's get you something to eat. They have a wonderful spread, shrimp cocktail, those little quitches you used to like. And there are so many people I want you to meet. Well, re-meet. Most of them remember you from when you were little. The prospect of being reintroduced to my parents, colleagues as the daughter who'd chosen a different path, their diplomatic phrase for disappointed us beyond measure, made my stomach clench. But I followed them toward the buffet table, past clusters of conversations about market projections and office renovations, past the life I'd deliberately chosen not to live. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine as they guided me through their world like a tourist who needed protection from getting lost, was that this world already knew me. They just didn't know that their daughter, the one they'd written off as a dreamer, a dropout, a cautionary tale about what happens when you don't listen to your parents, was about to change everything they thought they understood about success, failure, and the daughter they'd never really seen at all. But that revelation was still hours away. For now, I was just Cassandra Wilde, the disappointing daughter in the discount dress, trying to make it through her parents' retirement dinner without causing a scene. I had no idea I was about to become the scene. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Grandview Conference Center's crystal ballroom was everything my parents aspired to, but could never quite reach. Soaring 20-foot ceilings were draped in cascading white fabric that caught the light from 3 massive chandeliers, each one probably worth more than my parents' annual salary. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Millbrook Heights, glittering skyline, where glass towers stretched toward the stars like monuments to ambition. Every detail screamed success with a capital S. The centerpieces weren't just flowers. They were architectural arrangements of white orchids and silver branches that probably required a team of designers to create. The linens weren't just tablecloths. They were precisely pressed works of art that had never known the inside of a home washing machine. Even the waitstaff moved with a choreographed elegance, their black uniforms crisp and their smiles professionally calibrated. I stood near the entrance, taking it all in, and felt like a sparrow that had accidentally flown into a jewelry store. My simple black dress, the one I'd thought looked perfectly respectable when I put it on in my studio apartment, now felt like a costume from the wrong play. The fabric was cotton blend, not silk. The cut was classic, not couture. It was clean, pressed, and appropriate. But in this room full of designer everything, appropriate felt like failure. Around me, Meridian Industries' elite mingled with the confidence of people who belonged exactly where they were. The women wore dresses that probably had names I'd never heard of, paired with jewelry that caught the light like tiny captured stars. Their hair was styled in ways that suggested standing appointments with expensive salons, and their makeup was applied with the kind of precision that only comes from years of practice or professional application. The men were equally polished in their tailored suits, not the kind you bought off the rack at department stores, but the kind that required multiple fittings and personal relationships with haberdashers. Their watches weren't just timepieces, they were statements about success, taste, and the kind of money that accumulated slowly over decades of climbing corporate ladders. I watched them interact with each other, noting the subtle hierarchies in their body language. The way junior executives slightly deferred to senior management, the way department heads positioned themselves within speaking distance of the C-suite executives, the way conversations flowed around invisible but understood boundaries of rank and influence. This was my parents' world, or at least the world they observed from the edges. Dad, in his department store suit that he'd worn to every important occasion for the past 5 years, looked proud to be included. Mom, in her JCPenney dress suit, stood a little straighter than usual, as if proximity to this elegance might somehow transfer to her. They moved through the room with the careful enthusiasm of tourists in a museum, appreciative, respectful, and acutely aware that they were visitors, not residents. They spoke in slightly hushed tones, laughed a beat too late at jokes, and positioned themselves always at the periphery of conversations, rather than at the center. I found myself automatically mimicking their behavior, falling into the familiar pattern of making myself smaller, quieter, less noticeable. It was a survival mechanism I'd developed over years of family gatherings, school events, and social situations, where I felt perpetually out of place. Stay close to the walls. Don't draw attention. Observe rather than participate. It was safer that way. The buffet table was a masterpiece of culinary architecture. Towers of jumbo shrimp arranged around ice sculptures. Salmon carved into paper-thin slices and fanned across marble platters. Cheeses I couldn't pronounce arranged alongside fruits carved into flowers. Tiny quiches that looked too perfect to eat, each one a miniature work of art. I took a small plate, bone china of course, with Meridian's logo subtly embossed along the rim, and selected a few items with the careful restraint of someone who didn't want to appear greedy or unsophisticated. The shrimp alone probably cost more per pound than I typically spent on groceries in a week. From across the room, I could hear the gentle hum of conversations about stock options and retirement portfolios, about vacation homes in the Hamptons, and children attending Ivy League universities. These people lived in a parallel universe where success was measured in corner offices and country club memberships, where security meant knowing exactly where you'd be in 5, 10, 20 years. It was everything my parents had wanted for me and everything I'd walked away from. I'd chosen uncertainty over security, creativity over conformity, possibility over predictability. I'd chosen a life where success couldn't be measured in square footage or salary figures, where achievement looked different from anything displayed in this glittering ballroom. But standing here, surrounded by all this polished prosperity, I couldn't help but wonder if my parents had been right all along. Maybe this was what success actually looked like. Maybe my definition of achievement was just an elaborate justification for failure. The doubt crept in like cold air through a crack in a window, subtle at first, then increasingly uncomfortable. Maybe my years of following my passion had just been an expensive mistake. Maybe my parents' disappointment wasn't misguided but prophetic. Maybe I was exactly what I appeared to be in this moment, an underdressed outsider who didn't belong in a room full of people who had actually made something of themselves. I took a sip of champagne, real champagne, not the sparkling wine I occasionally splurged on for special occasions, and let its bubbles distract me from the growing sense that I was playing a role in someone else's story. The successful consultant, the independent daughter, The woman who had chosen her own path and found fulfillment outside conventional definitions of success. But costumes only work when everyone agrees to believe in the performance. And in this room, surrounded by the tangible evidence of traditional achievement, my carefully constructed narrative felt as fragile as the crystal glasses we held in our hands. What I didn't know yet, what I couldn't possibly imagine as I stood there questioning every choice I'd made over the past 8 years, was that this room full of successful professionals was about to discover something that would shatter their assumptions about success, achievement, and the quiet woman in the simple black dress who was trying so hard to blend into the background. The performance was about to end, and the real story was about to begin. "Thomas! Patricia!" The booming voice cut through the ambient chatter like a ship's horn through fog. I turned to see a tall, imposing man in his early 60s, striding toward us with the confident gait of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal suit was clearly custom-made, and his smile had the practiced warmth of a politician greeting constituents. "Mr. Hartwell!" Dad's voice pitched up with the nervous excitement of a student called upon by his favorite teacher. He straightened his tie and extended his hand with the eager deference of someone meeting royalty. "Thank you so much for organizing this evening. It's incredible, really incredible." James Hartwell, Senior Vice President of Operations, and my parents, direct superior for the past decade, clasped Dad's hand in both of his own. "Thomas, you've earned it. 37 years of dedicated service. That deserves recognition." His attention shifted to Mom with the smooth choreography of a man accustomed to working rooms. And Patricia, looking lovely as always. "How are you feeling about retirement? Ready to spend all day with this troublemaker?" He gestured toward Dad with a chuckle. Mom blushed like a schoolgirl. "Oh, Mr. Hartwell, you're too kind. We're both just grateful for all the opportunities Meridian has given our family over the years. It's been such an honor to be part of something so successful." The word, successful, hung in the air with reverent weight. In my parents' vocabulary, Meridian Industries wasn't just their employer. It was their church, their identity, their proof that hard work and loyalty eventually paid off. They spoke about the company the way other people talked about beloved family members. Mr. Hartwell's eyes found me then, and I saw the moment of calculation that occurs when someone encounters an unknown variable in a familiar equation. His smile remained professionally warm, but there was a flicker of assessment in his gaze, the look of a man trying to place a face or remember a name from a Christmas party 3 years ago. "And this must be," he waited, clearly hoping someone would fill in the blank. "Our daughter, Cassandra," Mom said, her voice carrying the complex mixture of pride and apology that had characterized her introductions of me for years. "Cassie, this is Mr. Hartwell. He's been Dad's boss for, oh, goodness, how long has it been?" 10 wonderful years, Mr. Hartwell said, extending his hand to me. His handshake was firm but brief, the kind reserved for people who weren't important enough to warrant extended attention. "Cassandra, lovely to meet you. Your parents talk about you often." I doubted that was true, or if it was, I suspected those conversations didn't paint me in particularly flattering colors. "It's nice to meet you too, Mr. Hartwell. What line of work are you in, Cassandra?" The question was polite, but perfunctory, the kind of small talk that fills space while minds wander to more important matters. "Consulting," I said simply. "Ah, consulting." He nodded with the blank expression of someone who had no idea what that meant but was too polite to admit it. "Well, that's flexible. Good for you." The pause before, flexible, spoke volumes. In Mr. Hartwell's world, flexible was code for not serious, uncertain, or possibly unemployed. Dad jumped in with the eager helpfulness of someone trying to manage an uncomfortable situation. "She's always been independent, our Cassie, marches to the beat of her own drum. We keep telling her she should consider something more stable. Maybe even apply here at Meridian. But you know how young people are these days. Equals, indeed." Mr. Hartwell agreed with a knowing smile. The traditional path isn't for everyone, I suppose. Some people prefer to explore their options. The phrase carried the gentle condescension of someone discussing a child's phase that everyone hoped would eventually pass. Exactly, Mom chimed in with relieved agreement. We support her choices, of course, but we do worry sometimes. The freelance life can be so unpredictable. No benefits, no security, no clear advancement path. She trailed off as if contemplating the horror of such uncertainty. Mr. Hartwell nodded sagely. Security is important, especially as one gets older. The corporate world offers structure, mentorship, clear expectations. There's comfort in knowing where you fit in the larger picture. His gaze swept the ballroom, taking in the evidence of that structure, the hierarchies, the traditions, the rewards for loyalty and conformity. That's exactly what we've always told her, Dad said with grateful enthusiasm. Look at what Meridian has given us. Steady income, good benefits, respect in the community. This company has been our foundation for nearly 4 decades. It's given our family stability, purpose, dignity. The conversation continued around me, but I found myself observing rather than participating. I watched how Mr. Hartwell's attention was distributed, fully present when speaking to my parents about company matters, politely distant when the topic turned to me. I noticed how other employees approached our group with careful timing, waiting for natural breaks in conversation before inserting themselves with deferential greetings. Mr. Hartwell, congratulations on the Pemberton acquisition, said a woman in her 40s, clearly senior management based on her confidence and expensive jewelry. The board meeting presentation was masterful. Thank you, Diana. Team effort, of course, but I'm pleased with how it turned out. He turned back to my parents briefly. Thomas, Patricia, I hope you'll excuse me. Diana, shall we discuss the integration timeline? And just like that, we were dismissed. Not rudely, but with the efficient politeness of someone who had more important conversations to pursue. My parents watched him walk away with the wistful expression of people who had briefly been included in something important and were now returning to their regular programming. Such a good man, Mom said softly. He didn't have to come over and chat with us personally. That's the kind of leader he is. He remembers the little people. The phrase, little people, stung more than it should have. Not because it was meant to be hurtful, but because it revealed how my parents saw themselves in the grand scheme of things. They were grateful for acknowledgement, thankful for inclusion, appreciative of any attention from the people who mattered. And by extension, that's how they saw me, as someone who had chosen to remain small, insignificant, outside the structures that gave life meaning and value. In their minds, I had walked away from the opportunity to be part of something important in favor of an uncertain path that led nowhere in particular. As the evening progressed, I watched the social dynamics play out around us, the way conversations stopped when certain executives approached, the way junior employees positioned themselves hopefully within the orbit of senior management, the way everyone seemed to know exactly where they stood in the invisible but absolute hierarchy that governed every interaction. My parents navigated this world with practiced humility, accepting their place in the structure with grateful contentment. They introduced me to their colleagues with the careful enthusiasm of people sharing something they weren't entirely proud of but loved anyway. This is our daughter Cassandra. She's in consulting. Different path, but we support her choices. Each introduction carried the same undertone. She's not what we hoped for, but we're doing our best to be understanding parents in a changing world. What none of them knew, what couldn't have occurred to them as they categorized and dismissed me based on my simple dress and vague job description, was that their entire understanding of success, hierarchy, and importance was about to be turned completely upside down. But for now, I was just Cassandra Wilde, the disappointing daughter who had chosen uncertainty over security, the cautionary tale about what happens when you don't listen to your parents, wisdom about the importance of knowing your place in the world. The buffet line had thinned out, leaving me standing alone near the carved ice sculpture of Meridian's logo when she approached. I recognized her immediately from the family photos Mom had shown me over the years. Amanda Cross, Dad's colleague from the facilities department, though she'd clearly climbed several rungs higher on the corporate ladder since those early pictures. Her blonde hair was styled in what I'd learned to recognize as the executive bob, precise, professional, and expensive. Her burgundy dress was tailored to perfection, and her smile had the sharp edges of someone who had fought for every promotion and wasn't about to let anyone forget it. "You must be Thomas's daughter," she said, her voice carrying the kind of honeyed authority that suggested she was used to being the most important person in most rooms. "I'm Amanda Cross, Regional Facilities Director. I've heard so much about you over the years." I doubted that was entirely true, but I accepted her offered handshake. "Cassandra, nice to meet you." "Oh, I know exactly who you are." Her laugh had a musical quality that somehow managed to sound both friendly and condescending. "You're the one who walked away from that lovely business degree to become an artist? Or was it a writer? I can never keep track of these creative pursuits." "Consultant, actually." "Right, consultant." She drew out the word like she was tasting something questionable. "How wonderfully entrepreneurial of you. I admire people who are willing to take risks, even when they don't quite pan out the way we hope." The assumption that my career hadn't panned out hung in the air like smoke from an expensive cigarette. She hadn't asked about my success or failure. She'd simply assumed the latter based on my appearance, my parents, careful introductions, and her own understanding of how the world worked. "Your parents are such dedicated employees," she continued, glancing across the room where Mom and Dad were engaged in animated conversation with a group from the accounting department. 37 years of loyal service. That's becoming rare in today's job-hopping culture. They represent the old-school values that built companies like Meridian." I nodded politely, recognizing the subtext. My parents represented stability and loyalty. I, by implication, represented the opposite. "I remember when you graduated college," Amanda continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone sharing a particularly instructive cautionary tale. "Your father was so proud. He showed everyone your degree, talked about how you were going to follow in his footsteps, maybe even surpass him. Such hopes, such dreams." The past tense wasn't accidental. In Amanda's narrative, those hopes and dreams belonged to a different era, before reality had set in and revealed the gap between parental ambition and actual achievement. "And then you decided to go your own way," she said, with the kind of understanding nod that suggested she'd seen this story play out many times before. "It's admirable, really. Not everyone has the courage to chase their passions, even when those passions lead to uncertainty." A waiter passed by with a tray of champagne, and Amanda smoothly exchanged her empty glass for a full one. The gesture was so effortless it spoke of years of corporate events, networking functions, and social situations where the right moves had been practiced until they became instinctive. "Tell me about this consulting work," she said, settling into the conversation like someone preparing to be entertained. "What kind of consulting? Small businesses, I imagine? Local entrepreneurs who need help with, what would that be exactly? Marketing? Basic business planning?" Her questions came rapid fire, each one narrowing the scope of what she assumed I was capable of. Not consulting for major corporations, but small businesses. Not strategic planning, but basic guidance. Not expertise, but elementary assistance. "I work with various clients," I said carefully. "Different industries, different needs." "How lovely," she said with the kind of smile that suggested she wasn't fooled by vague answers. "I'm sure it keeps you busy, though I imagine the income must be quite variable, feast or famine, as they say in the freelance world." The financial inquiry was delivered with surgical precision. In Amanda's experience, people who evaded specifics about their work usually did so because the specifics weren't impressive. And people who weren't making good money certainly weren't in a position to be coy about it. Your parents worry about you, you know, she continued, her voice softening into what might have been genuine concern if it hadn't carried such obvious undertones of superiority. Not that they'd ever say anything directly, they're far too supportive for that. But a parent's love includes worry, doesn't it? Especially when their child has chosen such an unconventional path. She leaned slightly closer, as if sharing a confidence. Between you and me, I think they'd sleep better at night knowing you had something more stable. Something with benefits, a clear advancement track, security for the future. The corporate world can be demanding, but it rewards dedication. Look at me. I started as an assistant 15 years ago, and now I oversee facilities operations for 3 states. The implication was crystal clear. She had climbed from assistant to director through hard work and smart choices. I had chosen uncertainty over security, and was presumably reaping the consequences of that decision. Have you ever considered applying here at Meridian? She asked, and I could hear the genuine offer in her voice, mixed with the kind of patronizing kindness usually reserved for charity cases. I'm sure we could find something suitable, maybe not at the executive level, of course, but there are always entry-level positions opening up. Administration, customer service, basic project coordination. Nothing glamorous, but steady work with good benefits. The word, suitable, was particularly stinging. Not something that matched my skills or experience, but something appropriate for someone of my limited prospects. Entry-level positions for the college graduate who had lost her way. And the wonderful thing about corporate structure, Amanda continued, warming to her theme, is that there's always room for growth. Look at your father. Started in the mailroom, worked his way up to senior facilities manager. Respectability, dignity, the satisfaction of being part of something larger than yourself. She gestured around the ballroom, taking in the evidence of corporate success surrounding us. This is what loyalty and dedication build. This is what happens when you commit to something meaningful instead of chasing dreams that may never materialize. The word, dreams, carried particular venom, as if the pursuit of anything beyond conventional success was inherently naive and ultimately futile. I hope you'll think about it, she concluded, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who believed she was offering genuine assistance to someone in need. Your parents have given so much to this company. It would be wonderful if the next generation could find a place here, too. A real place, with real security and real prospects for advancement. She squeezed my arm gently, a gesture that might have been comforting if it hadn't felt so much like pity. It's never too late to change course, Cassandra. Some people just take a little longer to find their way to where they belong. And with that final assessment of my life choices, she glided away toward a group of senior executives, leaving me standing beside the ice sculpture with the distinct feeling that I had just been thoroughly categorized, evaluated, and found wanting. What Amanda Cross couldn't possibly have known, what would never have occurred to her as she moved confidently toward conversations with people she considered her professional equals, was that her entire assessment of my life, my choices, and my prospects was about to be revealed as spectacularly, devastatingly wrong. Amanda's words echoed in my mind as I stood there, but they weren't new. I'd been hearing variations of that same message for 8 years, ever since the day I walked into my parents' living room and announced I wasn't going to law school after all. I was 22 then, fresh out of Riverside University with a business degree that had cost my parents $40,000 in loans and sacrifices. The plan had been simple, linear, and completely mapped out. Graduate, take the LSAT, get into a decent law school, join a respectable firm, work my way up to partner. Security, prestige, and the kind of predictable success that would make my parents beam with pride at gatherings exactly like this one. But standing in that living room 8 years ago, looking at the acceptance letter from Whitmore Law School that had arrived that morning, I couldn't do it. The path stretched ahead of me like a highway through flat, unchanging landscape. Straight, efficient, and completely soul-crushing. I'm not going, I'd said, the words tumbling out before I could second-guess myself into silence. Dad had been reading the newspaper in his recliner, Mom was sorting through mail at the kitchen table. Both of them froze like someone had paused a movie mid-scene. "Not going where, honey?" Mom had asked in the carefully neutral tone she used when she suspected bad news but hoped she was wrong. "Law school. I'm not going to law school." The newspaper rustled as Dad lowered it slowly, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, making him look like a confused professor. "What do you mean you're not going? You were accepted. To Whitmore. Do you know how competitive their program is?" I'd practiced this conversation in my head a dozen times, but facing their bewildered expressions, all my carefully rehearsed explanations crumbled. "I want to do something else. Something that matters to me." "Law matters," Mom had said, rising from the table with the kind of controlled energy that suggested she was fighting not to raise her voice. "Law is important. Law is stable. Law is what we've been working toward for 4 years." What we'd been working toward. Not what I'd been working toward, but what we, the family unit, the collective dream, had invested in. My education wasn't just about me. It was about validating their sacrifices, their long hours, their careful budgeting and planning. "I want to start my own business," I'd said, the words sounding smaller and less convincing than they had in my bedroom mirror. Dad had removed his glasses entirely then, cleaning them with deliberate, methodical strokes. It was his thinking gesture, the thing he did when he needed time to process information that didn't compute with his understanding of how the world worked. "What kind of business?" he'd asked finally. "Consulting. Strategic planning for organizations that need help streamlining their operations, improving efficiency, solving complex problems." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched my parents exchange one of those married couple looks that communicated volumes without a single word. It was the look that said, "Our daughter has lost her mind, but we need to handle this delicately." "Sweetheart," Mom had said, settling back into her chair with the patient expression of someone explaining basic arithmetic to a child. "You can't just decide to be a consultant. That's not how business works. You need experience first. You need credentials. You need to understand how companies actually operate before you can advise them." "Which is exactly what law school would give you," Dad had added, putting his glasses back on as if that would help him see a solution to this unexpected problem. "Corporate law, business law, contracts. It's all connected. Get your JD, work at a firm for a few years, then maybe you can think about branching out on your own." But I was 22 and absolutely certain that their version of branching out would never actually happen. I'd seen too many of their friends talk about what they were going to do someday. The businesses they'd start, the risks they'd take, the dreams they'd pursue once they had enough security, enough experience, enough money saved up. Someday never came for most of them. Someday got buried under mortgages and car payments and the comfortable inertia of steady paychecks. "I've already been accepted to Whitmore," Dad had continued, as if saying it again would somehow change my mind. "Cassandra, do you understand what an opportunity this is? Law school isn't something you just walk away from. This is your future we're talking about." Their future, more accurately. The future they'd imagined when they'd scrimp and save to pay for my education. The future they'd described to friends and neighbors with barely contained pride. Their daughter, the lawyer. Their daughter, the success story that would validate every sacrifice they'd made. Over the following weeks, they'd deployed every argument in their arsenal. Practical ones about financial security and career stability. Emotional ones about not wasting the opportunities they'd worked so hard to provide. Social ones about what people would think if I threw away such a prestigious acceptance. They'd brought in reinforcements. Uncle Robert, who was an accountant and understood business realities. Aunt Janet, who'd worked in HR for 20 years and could explain what employers actually looked for in candidates. Their financial advisor, who'd run numbers showing exactly how much money I was walking away from by not pursuing law. Every conversation had followed the same pattern. They'd present their case with the methodical thoroughness of prosecutors arguing before a jury. I try to explain my vision of building something from scratch, of solving problems in innovative ways, of creating value rather than just processing legal documents. And they'd respond with gentle but firm reminders about the difference between dreams and reality. "We love that you want to help people," Mom had said during one particularly painful discussion. "But you can help people as a lawyer, too, and you'll be able to pay your bills while you're doing it." The subtext was always the same. Your dreams are lovely, but they're not practical. Your ambitions are admirable, but they're not realistic. Your vision of success doesn't match the world's actual requirements for survival and security. When I'd finally moved out into a tiny studio apartment in Riverside that they'd visited once and declared temporary, surely, they'd maintained their optimism that this was just a phase, a quarter-life crisis that would resolve itself once I'd gotten this entrepreneurial energy out of my system. "She'll be back," I'd overheard Dad telling someone on the phone. "Once she realizes how hard it is out there without a real career, she'll come around. Maybe it's good for her to struggle a little bit. It'll make her appreciate security when she finds it." They'd never actually said the words, "We're disappointed in you," but disappointment had colored every interaction for years. It was in Mom's carefully neutral tone when friends asked about my work. It was in Dad's quick subject changes when conversations turned to career achievements. It was in their gentle but persistent suggestions about, quote, "keeping your options open and building a more solid foundation." They'd loved me, supported me, and worried about me. But they'd never believed in me. Not really. Not in the way that mattered when you're trying to build something from nothing, with only your own conviction to sustain you through the inevitable setbacks and failures. Standing in this ballroom now, surrounded by everything they'd always wanted me to aspire to, I could still feel the weight of those 8 years of gentle disapproval. The birthday cards with subtle suggestions about finding your path. The Christmas dinners where my work was briefly acknowledged and then dismissed in favor of discussing my cousins, promotions, and mortgage approvals. They'd been waiting patiently for me to grow up, come to my senses, and join the real world. They'd been kind about it, loving about it, but utterly convinced that my version of success was an illusion that would eventually be shattered by contact with reality. What they'd never understood, what they couldn't have imagined, as they watched me struggle through those early years of building something they couldn't see or measure, was that I hadn't been failing at their version of success. I'd been succeeding at something entirely different. The evening was reaching its crescendo when Mr. Hartwell took the microphone at the front of the ballroom. The conversations gradually died down as people turned their attention toward the small stage where a projection screen displayed a montage of photos from Meridian Industries, 4-decade history. My parents appeared in several of the images, younger versions of themselves at company picnics, award ceremonies, and holiday parties, always smiling, always positioned respectfully at the edges of group shots. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mr. Hartwell's voice carried easily across the room. "If I could have your attention for just a few moments. We're here tonight to celebrate something truly special, the kind of dedication and loyalty that built this company into what it is today." Polite applause rippled through the crowd as the slideshow continued, showing the evolution of Meridian's headquarters, its expanding operations, its growing influence in the industry. It was a visual narrative of success, measured in square footage, employee count, and market share. Thomas and Patricia Wilde represent the very best of what Meridian Industries stands for, Mr. Hartwell continued, gesturing toward my parents, who stood near the front of the room looking simultaneously proud and overwhelmed. Their story is the American dream in action. 2 young people who started at the bottom and built a life of dignity and purpose through honest work and unwavering commitment. More applause, warmer this time. I could see Mom wiping away tears, her face glowing with the recognition she'd waited 37 years to receive. Dad stood straighter than I'd seen him stand in years, his hand resting protectively on Mom's back, as if to steady her through this moment of long overdue acknowledgement. "Thomas began his career in our mailroom in 1987, Mr. Hartwell said, reading from prepared remarks. He was 22 years old, newly married, and determined to prove himself. Over the years, he worked his way up through facilities management, earning the respect of his colleagues and the trust of his supervisors through consistent performance and reliable character. The screen showed a photo of young Dad in his first company uniform, standing next to a mail cart with a grin that spoke of unlimited optimism about the future. Beside him, present-day Dad watched his younger self with the expression of someone seeing a beloved friend from long ago. Patricia joined our accounting department 5 years later, Mr. Hartwell continued, and quickly established herself as someone who could be counted on for accuracy, integrity, and attention to detail. Together, they've weathered every challenge this company has faced: economic downturns, industry changes, corporate restructuring. Through it all, they've remained steadfast in their commitment to excellence. I found myself genuinely moved by this tribute to my parents' dedication. Whatever my own feelings about corporate life, there was something undeniably admirable about their consistency, their loyalty, their willingness to show up every day and do their best work, regardless of recognition or reward. But then Mr. Hartwell's tone shifted slightly, taking on the inspirational cadence of someone building toward a larger point. The Wildes represent something we don't see enough of in today's world: the understanding that success isn't about chasing the next big opportunity or the latest trend. Real success, lasting success, comes from commitment. It comes from finding your place in a larger organization and dedicating yourself to making that organization better. I felt a prickle of unease, sensing where this was heading. In an era of job hopping and entrepreneurial fantasies, Thomas and Patricia chose substance over flash, security over risk, proven methods over unproven experiments. They understood that the individual achievement that matters most is the achievement that serves something greater than yourself. The phrase entrepreneurial fantasies hit like a slap. I looked around the room, wondering if anyone else had caught the subtle dig at people who chose paths outside traditional corporate structures. Several heads were nodding in agreement with Mr. Hartwell's assessment. They raised their family with these same values, he continued, and my stomach dropped as I realized he was about to make this personal. They understood that the greatest gift you can give your children is not just love and support, but guidance toward meaningful, stable careers that will provide security and dignity throughout their lives. The subtext was becoming text. This wasn't just a tribute to my parents' careers. It was a sermon about the right way to live, the right way to work, the right way to define success. And by implication, it was a judgment on anyone who had chosen differently. Of course, Mr. Hartwell said with a knowing smile, not every young person today appreciates that wisdom immediately. We live in a time when many college graduates think they can skip the fundamentals and jump straight to being their own boss. The internet has convinced an entire generation that traditional employment is somehow beneath them, that they can all be consultants and entrepreneurs and freelancers without ever learning how real businesses actually operate. The words hit like physical blows. He might as well have been reading from my resume. Around the room I could see people nodding and chuckling with recognition, as if he was describing a universal frustration they'd all experienced with wayward children and grandchildren. But parents like Thomas and Patricia never give up hope, Mr. Hartwell said, his voice taking on the warm tone of someone delivering a particularly touching observation. They know that eventually, reality has a way of teaching the lessons that experience should have taught earlier. They know that there's no substitute for the kind of foundation that only comes from working within established systems, learning from experienced mentors, and proving yourself through consistent performance rather than grand gestures. I could feel eyes turning toward me throughout his speech, subtle glances from people who had heard enough about Thomas and Patricia's daughter to recognize exactly who was being discussed. The disappointment. The one who had walked away from opportunity in favor of uncertainty. The beautiful thing about companies like Meridian, Mr. Hartwell concluded, building to his crescendo, is that we never close the door on talent, even when that talent takes a little longer to recognize where it truly belongs. We understand that some people need to wander in the wilderness for a while before they appreciate the value of a stable home. He raised his champagne glass toward my parents. So tonight, we celebrate Thomas and Patricia Wilde, not just for their years of service, but for their wisdom in choosing substance over style, commitment over chaos, and proven success over unproven dreams. They are living examples of what happens when you trust in time-tested values rather than chasing every entrepreneurial fantasy that promises easy rewards. The applause was thunderous. People were on their feet, genuinely moved by what they saw as an inspiring tribute to traditional values and sensible life choices. My parents were beaming, overwhelmed by the recognition and validation they'd waited decades to receive. And I stood in the back of the room, feeling like I'd just been publicly dissected and found wanting by someone who had never met me, never asked about my work, never shown the slightest interest in understanding what I'd actually built over the past 8 years. The message was clear. I was the cautionary tale, the example of what happens when young people think they know better than their elders. I was the wanderer in the wilderness, the dreamer who needed to be taught by reality, the entrepreneurial fantasy that would eventually be corrected by contact with the real world. Mr. Hartwell had just told a room full of successful professionals that my life's work was a phase, my achievements were illusions, and my choices were the predictable mistakes of someone too naive to understand how the world actually worked. What he didn't know, what couldn't possibly have occurred to him as he delivered his sermon about proven success versus unproven dreams, was that he had just publicly dismissed the one person in that room whose proven success dwarfed his own. The applause was still echoing through the ballroom when my phone buzzed against my clutch. I almost ignored it. This wasn't exactly the moment for checking messages, but something made me glance at the screen. The caller ID made my breath catch in my throat. Meridian Industries corporate line. That was impossible. I was standing in a room full of Meridian employees. Why would anyone from the company be calling me, unless... The phone buzzed again, insistent and demanding attention. Around me, people were still chatting about Mr. Hartwell's inspiring speech, glasses clinking as conversations resumed. My parents were surrounded by well-wishers offering congratulations and sharing their own stories of company loyalty. I slipped toward the hallway, away from the noise and celebration, and answered on the fourth ring. Cassandra Wilde speaking. Ms. Wilde, this is Janet Morrison from Meridian Industries Executive Office. The voice was crisp, professional, with an undertone of barely controlled urgency. I apologize for calling so late in the evening, but we have a situation that requires immediate attention. Janet Morrison. I knew that name from the organizational charts I'd been studying for the past 6 months. Executive assistant to the board of directors. The woman who controlled access to the most powerful people in the company. I'm listening, I said, stepping further into the quiet hallway where crystal sconces cast warm light on burgundy wallpaper. We've just received word that the Pemberton Industries integration is in serious jeopardy. The systems compatibility issues we discussed last month have escalated into a full-scale crisis. Their ERP system is completely incompatible with our infrastructure, and the deadline for the merger completion is Monday morning. My stomach tightened. The Pemberton acquisition that Mr. Hartwell had been congratulating himself on just moments ago was apparently falling apart in real time. The board is in emergency session, Janet continued. We need synergy solutions here tonight. Mr. Pemberton is threatening to walk away from the entire deal if we can't guarantee a seamless transition. We're talking about a $340 million acquisition that could collapse in the next 12 hours. Synergy Solutions, my company. The consulting firm that had spent the last 6 months secretly working with Meridian's board to identify and solve exactly these kinds of integration challenges. The firm whose recommendations had made the Pemberton acquisition possible in the first place. What's the current status? I asked, already shifting into problem-solving mode despite the surreal nature of taking a business crisis call while standing outside my parents' retirement dinner. Complete chaos. Our IT department is overwhelmed, our project management team is scrambling, and frankly, nobody knows how to coordinate between the two systems. We need someone who understands both companies, infrastructures, and can provide actionable solutions immediately. Through the open doors of the ballroom, I could hear Mr. Hartwell's voice again, probably making another toast or sharing another story about the values that built Meridian Industries. The irony was almost overwhelming. The board specifically requested synergy solutions, Janet said. Mr. Pemberton has apparently heard about your work with the Richardson Group merger last year. He says he won't proceed without your team's direct oversight of the integration process. The Richardson Group. That merger had been a $500 million deal that everyone in the industry said was impossible due to incompatible systems and competing corporate cultures. We'd solved it in 3 weeks, with a combination of strategic restructuring and innovative technology solutions that had become a case study taught in business schools. I need to ask, Janet said, her professional composure slipping slightly, is there any possibility you could come in tonight? I know it's incredibly short notice, but the board is desperate. They're willing to authorize whatever compensation is necessary. I looked back toward the ballroom, where my parents were still basking in recognition for their decades of reliable service. Where Mr. Hartwell was still holding court, probably sharing more wisdom about the dangers of entrepreneurial thinking. Where Amanda Cross was likely continuing to network with people she considered her professional equals. Ms. Morrison, I said carefully, I'm actually at a Meridian Industries event right now, the retirement dinner for Thomas and Patricia Wilde. There was a pause. Thomas and Patricia, from facilities and accounting? Oh my goodness, I didn't realize you had a connection to the company. They're my parents. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Your parents, Janet said finally, her voice carrying a note of something I couldn't quite identify. Surprise, certainly, but something else. Recognition, maybe, or the sound of puzzle pieces clicking into place. Ms. Wilde, the board has been trying to arrange a meeting with you for months. We've sent multiple requests through your office, but your assistant always said you were booked solid. The directors have been, well, frustrated isn't too strong a word. They've been calling you the most sought-after consultant in the region. The most sought-after consultant in the region. While my parents, colleagues were offering me entry-level positions out of pity. We had no idea you were connected to our employees, Janet continued. This changes things significantly. Could you possibly come upstairs? The boardroom is on the 15th floor of the Meridian Tower, just 3 blocks from your current location. The entire board is there, along with Mr. Pemberton and his team. I looked down at my simple black dress, my target ensemble that had seemed so inadequate just an hour ago. The irony was perfect. I was dressed exactly right for what was about to happen, just not for the reasons anyone would expect. Give me 15 minutes, I said. Thank you, Janet said, and the relief in her voice was palpable. The security desk will have your name. Take the private elevator to the 15th floor. And Ms. Wilde? Thank you for this. You might be saving a $340 million deal. I ended the call and stood in the hallway for a moment, processing what had just happened. In the space of 5 minutes, I'd gone from being the family disappointment who needed career guidance to being the emergency solution for the biggest crisis in Meridian Industries' recent history. Through the ballroom doors, I could see the celebration continuing. My parents were posing for photos with Mr. Hartwell and other executives, their faces glowing with pride and satisfaction. Amanda Cross was gesturing animatedly as she told some story to a group of admirers. The entire room was filled with people who believed they understood success, achievement, and the proper way to build a meaningful career. None of them had any idea that the woman they'd been dismissing all evening was about to walk into their corporate headquarters and solve a problem that their entire leadership team couldn't handle. I smoothed my dress, checked my phone to make sure I had the files I might need, and headed for the exit. As I passed the ballroom entrance, I caught my mother's eye and mouthed, "I'll be right back," gesturing toward my phone to indicate business. She nodded with the patient expression of someone accustomed to their daughter's unpredictable schedule. probably assuming I was dealing with some small consulting crisis that would take a few minutes to resolve. If only she knew I was about to walk into the biggest boardroom in the city and save the deal that everyone in that ballroom believed represented the pinnacle of corporate achievement. The real story was about to begin. The Meridian Tower pierced the downtown skyline like a glass and steel monument to corporate ambition. At 15 stories, it wasn't the tallest building in Millbrook Heights, but it commanded respect through sheer presence. Modern, imposing, and expensively understated. I'd driven past it countless times over the years, never imagining I'd one day walk through its marble lobby as anything other than a visitor. The security guard at the front desk looked up as I approached, his expression shifting from routine politeness to professional attentiveness when I gave my name. "Ms. Wilde, yes, ma'am. Ms. Morrison called down about you. Private elevator to the 15th floor, just around that corner." He gestured toward a separate bank of elevators I hadn't noticed, the kind reserved for executives and VIP visitors. "They're waiting for you." The elevator ride gave me 60 seconds to prepare for what was about to happen. I'd been in high-stakes boardrooms before, but never under circumstances quite like these. Never when my personal and professional worlds were about to collide in such a spectacular fashion. Never when the people I was about to help were the same ones who had just spent the evening dismissing everything I'd built. The 15th floor was executive country, thick carpets, understated lighting, and the kind of expensive artwork that whispered rather than shouted about the company's success. Janet Morrison was waiting when the elevator doors opened, and I recognized her immediately from the corporate website photos. Mid-50s, silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon, wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "Ms. Wilde, thank God you're here." Her relief was palpable as she extended her hand. "I can't tell you how much we appreciate this. The situation has gotten even worse since we spoke." She led me down a corridor lined with portraits of Meridian's leadership through the decades, men and women in expensive suits who had built the company into the regional powerhouse it was today. Their painted eyes seemed to watch as we passed, as if measuring whether I belonged in their corporate sanctuary. "The Pemberton team is threatening to walk out in the next hour," Janet explained as we walked. "Their CFO has been on the phone with their board, and apparently there's another company, Blackstone Enterprises, that's been circling, waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. If we can't solve the integration crisis tonight, Pemberton will take their deal to Blackstone tomorrow morning." Blackstone Enterprises. I knew them well. A ruthless competitor that specialized in acquiring companies that other firms couldn't successfully integrate. They were good at what they did, but they had a reputation for gutting acquired companies rather than preserving their value. If Pemberton went to Blackstone, hundreds of jobs would be eliminated within 6 months. "Here's what I need you to understand," Janet continued, stopping outside a set of double doors marked Executive Boardroom. "The people in this room represent the highest level of leadership at Meridian Industries. Our CEO, Douglas Pemberton from the acquisition target, 3 other board members, our head of IT, and our chief financial officer. They've been in crisis mode for the past 4 hours, and frankly, they're starting to panic." She paused, her hand on the door handle, and looked at me directly. "I don't know what your usual protocol is for client meetings, but I need to ask, are you prepared to take charge of this situation immediately? Because these are people who are used to being in control, and right now they need someone to tell them exactly what to do." I adjusted the simple silver necklace I was wearing, the only jewelry that had seemed appropriate for my parents' dinner, and nodded. "I'm ready." Janet pushed open the doors, and I stepped into a room that practically hummed with tension and barely controlled panic. The boardroom was everything you'd expect from a company like Meridian. A long mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of the city lights, and walls lined with awards and photographs documenting decades of corporate achievements. But tonight, All that polished success felt fragile. The 5 people seated around the table looked like survivors of a corporate shipwreck, surrounded by laptops, scattered papers, and the remnants of what had clearly been a very long day. Coffee cups and takeout containers suggested they'd been here for hours, working through problems that kept multiplying faster than they could solve them. At the head of the table sat a man I recognized immediately from business journals and industry publications, Robert Chen, CEO of Meridian Industries for the past 12 years. He was younger than I'd expected, probably mid-40s, with the kind of sharp intelligence that radiated even through exhaustion and stress. "Mr. Chen," Janet announced, "Patricia Wilde from Synergy Solutions." The reaction was immediate and striking. Every person in the room straightened slightly, like students when an important teacher entered the classroom. Chen rose from his chair with the kind of deference I hadn't seen directed at anyone all evening, except the most senior executives at the retirement dinner. "Ms. Wilde," he said, extending his hand with genuine warmth mixed with obvious relief, "thank you for coming on such short notice. We've been trying to get a meeting with you for months. I never imagined our first encounter would be under these circumstances." His handshake was firm, respectful, the kind reserved for equals rather than supplicants. The contrast with the dismissive politeness I'd received all evening was jarring. "When Janet told us you were already in the building, it felt like divine intervention," said a woman I recognized as Linda Reeves, Meridian's chief financial officer. "We've heard about your work with the Richardson Group integration. That was supposed to be impossible." "Nothing's impossible," I said, settling into the chair they'd obviously prepared for me at the center of the table, positioned where I could see all the screens and documents they'd been working with. Just expensive and complicated. A few chuckles around the table, the kind that suggested these people were ready to find humor wherever they could after hours of mounting crisis. "Here's where we stand," Chen said, immediately deferring to my expertise in a way that felt completely natural to him but would have shocked everyone at the retirement dinner. "The Pemberton acquisition was supposed to close Monday morning. We've discovered that their enterprise resource planning system is completely incompatible with our existing infrastructure. Our IT team estimates it would take 6 months to build a bridge between the systems." "6 months we don't have," added the IT director, a harried-looking man whose tie had been loosened hours ago. "Pemberton's board approved this deal based on our promise of seamless integration beginning Tuesday. If we can't deliver, they're walking." I pulled out my tablet and began accessing the files I'd been studying for months. Detailed analyses of both companies, systems, integration strategies I'd developed, solutions I'd crafted for exactly this scenario. Around the table, I could see faces relaxing slightly as I moved with the confident efficiency of someone who had dealt with far worse crises. "Show me the compatibility reports," I said, and suddenly I was no longer Patricia Wilde, the disappointing daughter in the discount dress. I was Patricia Wilde, CEO of Synergy Solutions, the consultant that Fortune 500 companies called when their most critical deals were falling apart. The transformation was so complete that for a moment I almost forgot where I'd been just 30 minutes earlier. Almost forgot the speeches about entrepreneurial fantasies and the need to learn from reality. But I didn't forget completely, because as I began diagnosing the crisis that had brought Meridian's leadership to the edge of panic, I couldn't help but think about all the people 3 blocks away who were still celebrating traditional success and proven methods. They had no idea that their company's future was being secured by the woman they'd been dismissing all evening as a cautionary tale about the dangers of choosing dreams over reality. 2 hours later, the crisis was contained. The solution hadn't been simple. It required a complete restructuring of both companies, data architecture, and the implementation of a proprietary integration protocol that my team had developed for exactly these scenarios. But by midnight, we had a framework that would not only salvage the Pemberton acquisition, but actually accelerate the integration timeline from 6 months to 6 weeks. "This is remarkable," Douglas Pemberton said, studying the implementation plan I'd outlined on the conference room smartboards. He was a compact man in his 60s with the kind of quiet intensity that suggested he hadn't built a $200 million company by accepting limitations. Our own consultants told us this level of integration was impossible without completely rebuilding our entire system. Most consultants think in terms of existing solutions, I replied, saving the final documents to the shared drive. Sometimes you have to create new ones. Robert Chen leaned back in his chair with the expression of a man who had just watched someone perform emergency surgery on his company's future. Ms. Wilde, I'm not exaggerating when I say you've probably saved this deal. The Pemberton acquisition isn't just about expansion for us. It's about survival. Without this merger, we'd be vulnerable to exactly the kind of hostile takeover that Blackstone Enterprises specializes in. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Mr. Hartwell had been delivering speeches about the importance of traditional corporate values, his company's entire future had been hanging by a thread that only my entrepreneurial fantasy could repair. There's something I need to tell you, I said, closing my laptop and looking around the table at faces that had transformed over the past 2 hours, from desperation to respect, to something approaching awe. The retirement dinner downstairs, for Thomas and Patricia Wilde, those are my parents. The silence that followed was profound. Linda Reeves blinked several times, as if trying to process information that didn't compute with her understanding of reality. The IT director actually laughed. Not with humor, but with the kind of disbelief that emerges when the universe reveals its sense of irony. Your parents work here? Chen asked slowly. For 37 years. Dad's in facilities management, mom's in accounting. Tonight was their retirement celebration. Douglas Pemberton shook his head with something that looked like wonder. We've been desperately trying to get a meeting with you for 6 months. Our board has been calling Synergy Solutions the most innovative consulting firm on the East Coast. And you've been here all along? Not exactly here, I said, but close enough. Janet Morrison, who had been quietly taking notes throughout our session, looked up with an expression I couldn't quite read. Ms. Wilde, forgive me for asking, but do your parents know what you do? I mean, specifically what you do. The question hung in the air like smoke from an expensive cigar. They know I'm a consultant. They think I work with small businesses, maybe do some freelance training workshops. They've never asked for details, and I've never offered them. But you run Synergy Solutions, Linda said, as if saying the words aloud might help her process their meaning. You're the CEO of a firm that Forbes called the secret weapon of Fortune 500 companies. You've orchestrated mergers worth billions of dollars. I have. Robert Chen stood up and walked to the window overlooking the city. From this height, the lights of Millbrook Heights spread out like a constellation, each glowing point representing businesses, dreams, successes, and failures playing out in real time. This is extraordinary, he said finally. Your parents have spent nearly 4 decades as loyal employees of this company. And their daughter whom we never knew existed, has become one of the most sought-after strategic consultants in the industry. He turned back to face the room. Do you realize what this means? The Wildes aren't just faithful employees we're honoring tonight. They're the parents of someone who could literally buy and sell companies like Meridian if she chose to. The phrase buy and sell was more accurate than he probably realized. Synergy Solutions' client roster included private equity firms that regularly acquired mid-sized companies, like Meridian. In fact, I'd turned down 3 separate requests to evaluate Meridian as a potential acquisition target, partly because of my parents' connection to the company. How is this possible? The IT director asked, his voice carrying the wonder of someone witnessing something that challenged his fundamental assumptions about how the world worked. How does someone build what you've built without anyone knowing? I built it quietly, I said simply. I started with one client, solved their problem, got referred to another client. I never sought publicity, never courted media attention. I let the work speak for itself. But the scale of it, Linda pressed. Synergy Solutions employs over 200 people. Your client list reads like the Fortune 500 directory. This isn't some small consulting practice. This is a major player in the industry." "It started small," I said, echoing the words I'd used with my parents countless times over the years, though they'd never understood what I meant by them. "Everything starts small if you go back far enough." Douglas Pemberton had been quiet throughout this exchange, but now he leaned forward with the focus of someone who had spent decades reading people and situations. "Ms. Wilde, may I ask why you've kept this private? Most people with your level of success would want recognition, especially from their family." The question touched the heart of 8 years of careful choices, because I needed to know that what I was building was real, that it could stand on its own merit without being propped up by family connections or social expectations. I needed to prove, to myself more than anyone, that I could create something valuable entirely on my own terms. "And now?" Chen asked. "Now that you've proven it beyond any possible doubt?" I looked around the room at these successful executives who had spent their evenings celebrating traditional achievement while desperately needing the kind of innovative thinking they'd been dismissing. The irony was perfect, complete, and somehow deeply satisfying. "Now," I said, "I think it's time my parents learned what their daughter actually does for a living." Chen smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression I'd seen from him all evening. "Ms. Wilde, I have a feeling that conversation is going to be very interesting indeed." Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the lights of the Grandview Conference Center 3 blocks away, where my parents were probably still accepting congratulations and sharing stories about their decades of loyal service. They had no idea that their daughter had just spent 2 hours saving the company that had been their whole professional world. They were about to find out. The retirement dinner was winding down when I returned to the Grandview Conference Center. The crowd had thinned considerably, leaving only the most dedicated celebrants and my parents, who were holding court at a corner table surrounded by photo albums and a small mountain of congratulatory cards. They looked up as I approached, their faces glowing with the satisfaction of an evening that had exceeded all their expectations. "There you are," Mom said, rising to embrace me. "We were worried when you disappeared for so long. Everything okay with work?" "Everything's fine," I said, settling into the empty chair they'd saved for me. "Actually, better than fine. But we need to talk." Dad's expression shifted slightly, the way it always did when conversations took unexpected turns. "Talk about what, sweetheart?" I looked around the nearly empty ballroom, at the lingering guests who were finishing their drinks and sharing final stories. Mr. Hartwell was across the room, deep in conversation with Amanda Cross and several other executives. In a few minutes, I would need to have a very different conversation with all of them, but first, this moment belonged to my parents. "Dad, Mom," I began, choosing my words carefully, "what exactly do you think I do for work?" They exchanged that married couple look again, the one that communicated entire conversations in a split second. Mom spoke first, her voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining something she'd explained many times before. "You're a consultant, honey. You help small businesses with their problems. Training workshops, organizational advice, that sort of thing. Freelance work." She paused, her smile becoming slightly strained. "It's not traditional employment, but you seem to enjoy the flexibility. And you work out of that little apartment in Riverside," Dad added, clearly trying to be supportive. "Very entrepreneurial. We admire your independence, even if we worry about the stability." I pulled out my phone and opened the Synergy Solutions website, turning the screen toward them. The homepage displayed our company logo, a sleek, interlocking design that suggested both collaboration and innovation, along with a tagline that read, "Strategic Solutions for Complex Challenges." "This is my company," I said simply. Mom put on her reading glasses and studied the screen, her forehead creasing as she tried to process what she was seeing. The website was professionally designed, clearly expensive, with testimonials from CEOs and case studies from major corporations. Synergy Solutions, she read aloud. Strategic consulting for Fortune 500 companies. She looked up at me, confusion evident in her eyes. Honey, this looks like a big company. Are you working for them? I don't work for them, Mom. I own them. I'm the founder and CEO. The silence that followed was different from any quiet moment I'd ever experienced with my parents. It wasn't comfortable or companionable. It was the silence of people trying to reorganize their entire understanding of reality. Dad leaned forward and took the phone, scrolling through pages that detailed client successes, team bios, and corporate achievements. His face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, dawning comprehension, and something that might have been shock. Cassie, he said slowly, this says you have over 200 employees. 237 as of last month. Mom reached for the phone with slightly shaking hands. It says here that you've managed mergers worth over $3 billion. She looked up at me as if I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. Billion with a B? Yes, but that's... Dad started, then stopped, unable to finish the thought. Impossible? I suggested gently. Too big for someone like me? Too successful for the daughter who walked away from law school? The words weren't intended to be cruel, but I could see them land like small stones thrown into still water, creating ripples of recognition and discomfort. We didn't know, Mom whispered, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the remaining party guests. How could we not know? Because you never asked, I said, and immediately regretted the sharpness in my tone. I mean, you asked if I was paying my bills, if I was eating enough, if my apartment was safe. But you never asked what I was actually building. Dad set the phone down carefully, as if it might explode. Cassandra, if this is real, and I'm not saying it's not, I just need a minute to process. If this is real, then you're... Successful? I offered. Wealthy? Everything you wanted me to be? Just not in the way you expected? Mom's eyes were welling up with tears, but I couldn't tell if they were tears of joy, regret, or something more complicated. Why didn't you tell us? All these years, we've been worried about you, trying to help you find stability, offering advice about getting a real job. And you were all ready. Running a multi-million-dollar company, I finished, yes. But the coffee shop, Dad said, grasping for something familiar in this new reality. You work at that coffee shop in Riverside. 3 days a week, yes. I own a small stake in it, actually. The owner is a client who needed help restructuring his business model. I work there because I like the atmosphere for writing proposals, and because it keeps me connected to small business operations. Every explanation seemed to deepen their confusion rather than clarify it. They were trying to reconcile 8 years of assumptions with information that contradicted everything they thought they knew about their daughter's life. The apartment, Mom said suddenly, that tiny studio apartment. If you're really as successful as this website suggests, why are you living in a small apartment in a working-class neighborhood? I smiled. Because I like it there. Because it's real. Because success doesn't have to look like what everyone expects it to look like. Dad was staring at his hands, his mind clearly working to process everything he was learning. Cassie, when we talked about you finding stability, getting a regular job, maybe even working here at Meridian, you were offering me entry-level positions at a company that's been desperately trying to hire my firm for months, I said gently. Amanda Cross suggested I apply for basic project coordination. Mr. Hartwell spent his speech tonight talking about people who chase entrepreneurial fantasies instead of accepting proven methods. The irony was finally landing, and I could see it in their faces. The recognition that their attempts to guide me toward success had been based on a complete misunderstanding of what I'd already achieved. Oh my God, Mom breathed. Tonight, when Mr. Hartwell was talking about young people who think they can skip the fundamentals, who think they can be consultants and entrepreneurs without learning how real businesses work. He was talking about me, I confirmed, and about an hour after that speech, I spent 2 hours in Meridian's boardroom, saving a $340 million acquisition that was about to collapse. Dad looked up sharply. The Pemberton deal? That was you? I nodded. Robert Chen and his entire board were in crisis mode. They called Synergy Solutions because we were the only firm they trusted to handle the integration problems. I solved it tonight, while you were down here celebrating traditional corporate success. Mom covered her face with her hands, and I could see her shoulders shaking slightly. When she looked up, her mascara was smudged, but her expression was one of awe mixed with something that might have been embarrassment. "We've been so wrong," she said, "about everything, about your choices, about what success looks like, about what you were capable of." She paused, struggling with words. "About who you really are." "You weren't wrong about loving me," I said. "You weren't wrong about wanting what was best for me. You were just wrong about what best meant." Dad reached across the table and took my hand. "Cassie, I don't know what to say. I'm proud of you. I'm incredibly proud of you, but I'm also ashamed that we didn't see what you were building, that we didn't believe in you when you needed us to." "You did believe in me," I said. "You just believed in a version of me that fit your understanding of how the world works. The problem wasn't your love or your support. The problem was that my definition of success was bigger than anything you could imagine." Around us, the last of the party guests were gathering their things and heading for the exits. Soon we'd have to return to a world where this conversation would change everything about how we related to each other. But for now, we sat in the aftermath of revelation, trying to rebuild a relationship based on truth instead of assumptions. The reckoning was complete. Now came the even harder part, figuring out what came next. The conversation with my parents was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. I looked up to see Robert Chen walking across the nearly empty ballroom, his expression a mixture of professional urgency and barely contained excitement. Behind him followed Linda Reeves and Janet Morrison, moving with the purposeful stride of executives who had just made a significant decision. "Ms. Wilde," Chen said as he reached our table, then paused as he noticed my parents. His demeanor immediately shifted to include them in the conversation with the kind of respectful acknowledgement reserved for people connected to someone important. "Mr. and Mrs. Wilde, I hope you don't mind the interruption, but I needed to speak with your daughter about some urgent business matters." Dad looked between Chen and me with an expression that suggested he was still trying to process the new reality, where his daughter warranted personal visits from CEOs. "Of course," he said, starting to stand. "We can give you some privacy." "Please don't leave on my account," Chen said, gesturing for them to remain seated. "Actually, I'm hoping you might want to hear this as well." He pulled out a chair and sat down with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to taking control of any situation. "Ms. Wilde, the board held an emergency session after you left. We've made a decision that I believe will interest you significantly." I could feel my parents watching this interaction with fascination, seeing their daughter treated with a level of professional deference they'd never witnessed before. Chen wasn't just being polite. He was speaking to me as an equal, someone whose opinion and agreement he needed, rather than someone he was graciously acknowledging. "We want to offer Synergy Solutions an exclusive consulting contract," Chen continued, "not just for crisis management like tonight, but as our primary strategic partner for all major initiatives. The Pemberton integration was supposed to be our biggest challenge of the year, and you solved it in 2 hours. We want that level of expertise available to us on an ongoing basis." Linda Reeves stepped forward, carrying a leather portfolio that probably contained documents worth more money than my parents had seen in their combined careers. The initial contract would be for 3 years, renewable, with a guaranteed minimum of $15 million per year regardless of project scope. The number hung in the air like a physical presence, $15 million annually, more than Meridian Industries paid in salary to half their workforce combined. I glanced at my parents, who were staring at Linda with expressions of complete bewilderment. That's just the baseline, Chen continued. Individual projects would be billed separately, and based on tonight's performance, I suspect we'll be utilizing your services extensively. He paused, his smile becoming almost conspiratorial. There's also the matter of the Pemberton deal itself. Your intervention tonight didn't just save the acquisition, it improved it. The integration timeline you've created will save us approximately $8 million in transition costs. Which brings us to our real proposition, Janet Morrison said, opening her own folder. The board has authorized me to offer Synergy Solutions a performance bonus for tonight's work. $2 million, plus a seat on Meridian's Strategic Advisory Board. $2 million for one evening's work. For solving a problem that their entire leadership team couldn't handle. I could see my father doing mental calculations, probably trying to figure out how many years of his salary that represented. There's more, Chen said, and I could tell he was enjoying the dramatic build-up. We're also prepared to offer you the position of Chief Strategic Officer for Meridian Industries. Full executive status, corner office, complete autonomy over all strategic initiatives. The salary would be commensurate with your expertise. We're thinking in the range of $2 million annually, plus equity participation. The job offer was presented with the kind of serious respect usually reserved for recruiting someone away from a competitor. This wasn't charity or an entry-level opportunity. This was Meridian Industries trying to acquire the services of someone they considered essential to their future success. Mom leaned forward slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. Did he just offer you $2 million a year? As an employee, I clarified gently, which would actually be a significant pay cut from what Synergy Solutions generates annually. Chen laughed, not mockingly but with genuine appreciation for the irony. She's right, of course. We're essentially trying to hire someone who could probably buy our company if she wanted to liquidate her assets and make us an offer. The phrase "buy our company" caused Dad to grip the edge of the table as if he needed physical support to process what he was hearing. His daughter, the one who had disappointed him by walking away from law school, the one he'd worried about for 8 years, was being courted by the CEO of the company where he'd spent his entire career. I appreciate the offer, I said, but I'm not looking to become anyone's employee. However, the consulting contract is interesting. Synergy Solutions values strategic partnerships with companies that are serious about innovation and growth. Name your terms, Linda said immediately. Whatever it takes to ensure we have priority access to your expertise. I could see the shift happening in real time, the moment when corporate hierarchy inverted itself completely. These executives, who had spent the evenings celebrating traditional success and proven methods, were now negotiating from a position of need with someone whose entrepreneurial fantasy had become their essential solution. I'll need to review the scope of work with my team, I said. Synergy Solutions has a very specific process for evaluating long-term partnerships. We'll need complete access to your strategic planning process, full disclosure of your operational challenges, and the authority to implement solutions without bureaucratic interference. Done, Chen said without hesitation, whatever you need. And I'll need assurance that this partnership is based on results, not politics. If your board isn't prepared to implement recommendations that challenge conventional thinking, then we're not the right fit. After tonight's demonstration, quote, Janet said, I think you'll find our board very open to unconventional approaches. The negotiation continued for another 20 minutes, with my parents watching in fascination as some of the most powerful executives in the region deferred to their daughter's expertise and authority. Every few minutes, one of them would address my parents directly, including them in the conversation with the kind of respectful attention usually reserved for the families of celebrities or dignitaries. Mr. and Mrs. Wilde, Chen said finally, I hope you understand how extraordinary your daughter is. In 30 years of business, I've never encountered someone who could diagnose and solve complex strategic problems with this level of precision and speed. "We're beginning to understand," Dad said, his voice carrying a mixture of pride and amazement that suggested he was still adjusting to this new version of reality. As the executives prepared to leave, Chen turned back to me one final time. "Ms. Wilde, there's one more thing I wanted to mention. Mr. Hartwell will be very interested to learn about tonight's developments." I believe his speech this evening touched on the importance of proven methods over unproven experiments. The irony in his voice was subtle but unmistakable. I think he'll find it educational to discover that the most proven method for solving complex business problems is hiring someone who understands that innovation and tradition aren't mutually exclusive. After they left, my parents and I sat in the quiet ballroom, surrounded by the remnants of an evening that had transformed all our understanding of success, achievement, and the distance between dreams and reality. "Cassie," Mom said finally, "I think we need to have a very long conversation about the last 8 years." I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in years. "I think that's a very good idea." The power dynamic had shifted completely, not just between me and my parents, but between everything I represented and everything they'd been taught to value. Tomorrow, we'd begin the much harder work of building a relationship based on truth instead of assumptions. But tonight, for the first time in 8 years, I didn't feel like the family disappointment. I felt like exactly who I'd always been, finally seen and acknowledged by the people whose opinion had mattered most. 3 months later, I stood in the same crystal ballroom where my parents' retirement dinner had taken place, but everything about the evening was different. The Grandview Conference Center was hosting Meridian Industries' annual shareholders meeting, and I was there not as a family member hiding in the shadows, but as the keynote speaker addressing the company's strategic future. The integration with Pemberton Industries had been completed 2 weeks ahead of schedule and $12 million under budget. The success had generated industry-wide attention, with 3 major business publications featuring synergy solutions on their covers, and Harvard Business School requesting permission to develop a case study on our integration methodology. From the podium, I could see my parents sitting in the front row, their faces glowing with a pride that was both familiar and completely transformed. Dad wore a new suit, not because he needed one, but because he wanted to look appropriate for what he now understood was a significant professional event. Mom had her phone out, not to check messages, but to take photos of their daughter addressing a room full of executives and investors. The audience was different too. Where 3 months ago I had encountered polite dismissal and condescending advice, tonight I saw faces turned toward me, with the kind of attention reserved for someone whose opinions carried weight and whose recommendations could affect stock prices. The Pemberton integration taught us something important about the nature of innovation, I said, advancing to my next slide, which showed the dramatic improvement in efficiency metrics since the merger. Success isn't about choosing between tradition and innovation. It's about understanding that the most powerful solutions often come from combining proven principles with creative approaches. In the back of the room, I spotted Mr. Hartwell and Amanda Cross. Their expressions were attentive, professional, and completely different from the patronizing dismissal they'd offered 3 months earlier. After my identity had become known throughout the company, both had reached out with enthusiastic congratulations and offers to, quote, collaborate on future initiatives. The lesson extends beyond business strategy, I continued, moving into the portion of my speech that felt most personal. Too often, we make assumptions about people's capabilities based on limited information. We see someone who doesn't fit our traditional definitions of success and assume they must be failing at what we consider important, rather than succeeding at something we haven't learned to recognize. The words carried weight because everyone in this room knew the story by now. Within days of the Pemberton deal's completion, the tale of the unknown consultant, who had saved the acquisition while being dismissed at a company dinner, had spread throughout Millbrook Heights' business community. It had become a cautionary tale about assumptions, a reminder that expertise doesn't always announce itself in expected ways. Which brings me to the broader message I want to share tonight, I said, pausing to let my eyes sweep across the room. Success isn't always visible. Achievement doesn't always fit conventional templates. And the person you might be overlooking in your company, in your industry, in your own family, might be the one who has exactly the capabilities you need most. In the question and answer session that followed, a young woman in her 20s raised her hand. She introduced herself as Sarah Kim, a junior analyst in Meridian's planning department, and her question went straight to the heart of what I'd hoped to address. "Ms. Wilde," she said, "I've been with the company for 2 years, and I often feel like my ideas aren't taken seriously because of my age and position. How do you recommend someone prove their value when others have already decided what you're capable of?" The question resonated throughout the room. I could see nodding heads, particularly among younger employees who had probably experienced similar dismissals. "The most important thing to understand," I replied, "is that you don't need anyone's permission to be excellent at what you do. Build your expertise, solve problems that matter, and focus on creating value rather than demanding recognition. Excellence has a way of speaking for itself, even when it takes longer than you'd like for people to listen." "But what if they never listen?" Sarah pressed. "What if the system doesn't reward the kind of value you're creating?" I thought about 8 years of careful choices, of building something meaningful while being consistently underestimated, of maintaining faith in my vision when everyone around me suggested I was wasting my potential. "Then you build your own system," I said. "You create something so undeniably valuable that the existing system has to acknowledge it. And sometimes, if you're very fortunate, you discover that the people who doubted you weren't trying to limit you. They were just operating within the boundaries of their own experience." After the formal presentation ended, the reception that followed felt like a completely different event from my parents' retirement dinner. People approached me with genuine respect, seeking advice and offering opportunities. The conversations were substantive, professional, focused on what I could contribute rather than what I might be lacking. But the moment that mattered most came when I found myself in a quiet corner with my parents, away from the business networking and corporate strategizing. "I owe you an apology," Dad said, his voice carrying the weight of months of reflection. "Not just for not understanding what you were building, but for not trusting that you knew what you were doing. We spent so many years trying to guide you toward our definition of success that we never asked what success meant to you." "You don't owe me an apology for loving me," I said. "You don't owe me an apology for wanting what you thought was best. You just owe it to yourself to understand that there are many different ways to build a meaningful life." Mom took my hand, her eyes bright with tears that seemed to combine regret and pride in equal measure. "I keep thinking about all those conversations where we suggested you needed to find something more stable, more traditional. We had no idea we were giving career advice to someone who was already more successful than we could imagine." "The advice came from love," I said. "That's what mattered. The fact that it was based on incomplete information doesn't diminish the intention behind it." As the evening wound down and guests began filtering toward the exits, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this moment. 3 months ago, I had been the family disappointment in a discount dress, listening to speeches about the importance of traditional values and proven methods. Tonight, I was the featured speaker at a corporate strategy meeting, being consulted by the same people who had once offered me entry-level positions out of pity. But the transformation that mattered most wasn't in how others saw me. It was in how my parents and I saw each other. We'd moved from a relationship based on assumptions and gentle disappointment to one built on truth and mutual respect. They finally understood what I'd been building, and I finally understood that their concerns had always been expressions of love, rather than limitations. The real lesson wasn't about proving anyone wrong or achieving dramatic vindication. It was about the importance of believing in your own vision, even when others can't see it, of building something meaningful regardless of external validation, and of understanding that people's capacity to recognize value is often limited by their own experience and expectations. As we walked out of the Grandview Conference Center together, my parents flanking me with the kind of pride that felt both familiar and completely new, I realized that the most important audience for your success isn't the people who doubted you. It's the people who loved you all along but needed help understanding what you were truly capable of achieving. Success isn't about proving others wrong. It's about proving yourself right, and then having the grace to help others understand what they missed while you were quietly building something extraordinary. The story wasn't really about revenge or vindication. It was about patience, persistence, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that your worth doesn't depend on anyone else's ability to recognize it. Sometimes the best way to change people's minds isn't to argue with their assumptions. It's to build something so undeniably valuable that their assumptions become irrelevant. And sometimes, if you're very fortunate, the people who matter most will not only recognize what you've accomplished, but will love you even more for having the courage to build it on your own terms. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.